The metal chair groaned under Commander Vexdale's weight as he shifted uncomfortably in the officer's lounge. The lights above cast harsh shadows across his battle-scarred shell, making the deep gouges and burn marks look even more dramatic. These weren't decorative scars. Each one told a story of survival against impossible odds. The largest gash ran from his left shoulder to his chest, a souvenir from the infamous Battle of the Shattered Moons where he'd held off an entire enemy squadron single-handedly. Around the curved table sat the most decorated military minds in the known galaxy. General Korth of the Krillian Empire drummed his clawed fingers against the surface, his 4 yellow eyes taking turns to blink, a nervous habit his enemies had learned to fear. To his right, Admiral Wyexandra's purple tentacles moved like living cables, occasionally tightening around her crystal command staff that never left her side. The Zenthari tacticians, known for their ability to calculate battle outcomes with frightening accuracy, sat perfectly still except for the occasional twitch of their antennae. These weren't ordinary soldiers sharing war stories over drinks. This was an emergency gathering of the hegemony's top brass, called together after disturbing reports from the human frontier had started filtering back to high command. Nobody had expected Vexdale, the legendary hero of a dozen impossible battles, to be the one requesting this meeting. "Repeat what you just said," General Korth demanded, his gravelly voice carrying the authority of someone who'd conquered 3 star systems before his 30th molting cycle. "Because I must have heard wrong. You're telling us that you, Commander Vexdale, survivor of the Crystal Nebula Massacre, slayer of the Void Queen herself, are afraid of humans." The word, afraid, hung in the recycled air like a toxic gas. In Keth Moran culture, admitting fear was worse than admitting defeat. Warriors who showed cowardice were exiled to the Outer Rim to live out their days in shame. For someone of Vexdale's status to use, that word was like watching a mountain crumble. Vexdale's mandibles, the sharp, jaw-like appendages that flanked his mouth, clicked together in a rhythm that other Kethmorans recognized as extreme agitation. It was the same sound their ancestors made when cornered by predators on their home world's deadly surface. His normally steady voice cracked as he spoke. "I have stood toe-to-toe with creatures that could melt steel with their breath. I've watched the Void Rippers tear holes in reality itself and stepped through them like doorways. I've seen beings made of pure energy that could exist in 11 different dimensions at once." His compound eyes, each containing thousands of individual lenses, seemed to lose focus as memories flooded back. The crystalline horrors of Sector 7 could turn your thoughts into weapons against you. The Shadow Fleet could make entire planets forget they existed. Admiral Wyexandra's tentacles stopped their constant movement, always a bad sign. Her species communicated as much through tentacle positioning as through spoken words, and complete stillness meant either deep thought or preparing to strike. But humans are just flesh. Soft, pink flesh wrapped around fragile bones. They have no natural weapons, no acid glands, no electromagnetic pulse organs. Their teeth can barely pierce their own food. "Exactly," Vexdale whispered, and somehow that whisper was more terrifying than any battle cry. "That's what makes them so dangerous." The silence that followed was so complete, you could hear the ship's life support systems humming through the walls. Even the ever-present background chatter from the bridge crew seemed to fade away. The assembled officers exchanged glances that spoke volumes in their respective alien languages. This was Vexdale, the same warrior who'd once used a broken piece of his own shell to kill a Void Ripper when his weapons ran out of power. The same commander who'd led the successful defense of the Omega Station when everyone said it was impossible. If he was scared of anything, they all should be terrified. The scratching sound of Vexdale's claws against the metal table filled the silent lounge as memories from 3 years ago came flooding back. His eyes seemed to look right through the assembled officers, seeing something that existed only in his mind. The Kepler offensive had been supposed to be a routine expansion mission, another primitive species to add to the hegemony's growing empire. The intelligence reports made them sound like children playing with fire. Vexdale continued, his voice taking on a mechanical tone that Kethmorans use when reciting battle records. No natural armor plating like the Koroth. No poison glands like the Scythic Confederation. Their bones were hollow in places, making them lighter but weaker. Our analysts calculated that a single Kethmoran warrior could overpower 5 humans in direct combat. General Korth leaned forward, his scarred face showing genuine interest. So what went wrong with the calculations? Nothing went wrong. The calculations were correct. Vexdale's antennae drooped slightly. That's what made it so disturbing. We found their patrol ship, designation US Defiant, drifting near the asteroid belt. Long-range sensors showed massive hull breaches, failing life support, no weapons power. 50 of our finest warships surrounded them in perfect formation. Admiral YX Sandra's tentacles began their slow, swaying motion again. Standard surrender protocol should have activated immediately. No rational species fights when victory is impossible. That's exactly what I thought. Vexdale said, his claws now leaving visible scratches in the table's surface. I opened a communication channel, expecting to hear their captain begging for mercy or negotiating terms. Instead, I heard something I'd never encountered in 30 years of warfare. The assembled officers waited, hanging on every word. Colonel Frex, whose species was known for their impatience, actually held perfectly still. They were making coordinated vocal sounds, not screaming, not crying, not even talking. Just these strange melodic patterns that seemed to come from multiple crew members at once. Our translation computers couldn't process it because it wasn't language as we understand it. It was something called music. Music? General Chorus for eyes blinked in confusion. Apparently, humans create these sounds for emotional purposes. Not communication, not warning calls, just expression. Vexdale's voice grew quieter. While their ship was literally falling apart around them, while oxygen leaked into space through dozen holes, they chose to spend their final moments creating beautiful sounds together. The lounge felt colder somehow. Every alien present understood the concept of final battle cries or death threats, but this was something entirely different. I watched through the view screen as Captain Tom Miller, yes, I learned his name later, moved through his dying ship. Half his crew was already dead. The other half was working frantically to keep life support running for just a few more minutes. But Miller wasn't trying to fix anything. Vexdale paused, his mandibles clicking rapidly. He was moving from station to station, checking on each crew member, making sure they could still participate in their singing. An engineer named Kate Williams had a broken arm, so he helped her reach the controls she needed. When their communications officer passed out from oxygen loss, Miller personally carried him to a better position. "This makes no tactical sense," muttered one of the Zen 3 tacticians. That's when I realized we were dealing with something unprecedented. Their reactor was going critical. We could see the energy reading from here. Any rational crew would have spent those final minutes trying to escape or surrender. Instead, they were using their reactor's overload as a weapon. The officers exchanged worried glances. Using a dying ship as a bomb wasn't unheard of, but doing it while singing was beyond their comprehension. Miller's crew managed to turn their reactor into the largest explosive device I'd ever seen. But here's the part that still haunts me. They never stopped singing. Even when the hull began glowing white-hot from the impending explosion, even when they knew death was seconds away, those humans kept making music together. Vexdale's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. The explosion took out 3 of our cruisers and damaged 5 others. But the last thing our sensors recorded before the Defiant disappeared in a ball of plasma was the sound of human voices, harmonizing perfectly right until the end. The temperature in the officers' lounge seemed to drop several degrees as Vexdale's voice took on an even more disturbed tone. His exoskeleton plates, which had been shifting slightly with nervous energy, now began to rattle, a sound that made every alien present instinctively reach for weapons that weren't there. Titan's Gate was supposed to be a simple mop-up operation, he began, his compound eyes focusing on a spot somewhere beyond the walls of the ship. We had successfully routed the human fleet. Their ships were scattered, retreating in different directions. Standard military doctrine. Say what you can, regroup at a safe distance, plan your next move. General Korth nodded approvingly. Logical. Preserve resources for future engagements. Exactly what any rational species would do. The human frigate Indomitable was limping away from the battlefield with significant damage. Hull breaches on 3 decks, main engines operating at 30% capacity, weapon systems completely offline. Captain Beth Davies had every reason to continue her retreat. Admiral Sandra's tentacles coiled tighter around her command staff. But she didn't. That's when we intercepted a distress transmission from a civilian transport ship, the Haven's Rest. It was carrying refugees from the Altair system. But here's the crucial detail that changed everything. Vexthal's mandibles clicked in agitation. These weren't human refugees. They were Vorthak civilians, a species humans had never even encountered before this war. The silence that followed was profound. Every officer present understood the implications. Military alliances were one thing, but risking lives for complete strangers from a species you'd never met violated every principle of warfare they knew. The Haven's Rest had suffered catastrophic engine failure during our assault. It was dead in space with over 3,000 Vorthak families aboard. Elderly, children, civilians who had nothing to do with the war. Their life support was failing, and they had maybe 2 hours of breathable air left. Colonel Threx leaned forward, his scale brow furrowed in confusion. Surely the human captain continued her retreat? Tactical withdrawal is basic survival protocol. Vexthal's laugh was bitter and hollow. Captain Davies received that distress call and without hesitation, without even consulting her crew, ordered her ship to turn around. Her navigator, Lieutenant Commander Rick Hayes, actually questioned the order. He pointed out that the Indomitable was barely functional, that they were outnumbered 50-1, that attempting a rescue would be suicide. And, prompted Admiral Wyaxandra. Davies looked at him like he'd suggested they stop breathing. She said, and I quote from our intercepted communications, "Rick, there are children on that ship. We're going back." That was it. No debate, no strategic analysis, no consideration of odds. Just a simple statement of intent. The assembled officers exchanged glances that spoke volumes in their respective species' silent languages. This went against everything they understood about military command structure and rational decision-making. What happened next defied every law of physics and probability I thought I understood. The Indomitable flew directly through our battle formation, not around it, not under it, straight through the middle. We had 47 warships between Davies and that transport vessel. She ignored every single weapon we fired at her. Vexthal's claws left deeper scratches in the table as he continued. Our tactical computers couldn't understand what she was doing. Her flight pattern made no sense from a combat perspective. She wasn't trying to engage us or fight her way through. She was simply flying toward the refugees, as if we weren't there. "Impossible," muttered General Korth. "No ship could survive that kind of concentrated fire. The Indomitable shouldn't have lasted 30 seconds. But Davies had her crew redirecting power from everything, life support, communications, even artificial gravity, just to keep the engines running. Engineer Paula Jenkins literally welded hull plates back together while under enemy fire. Dr. Henry Clark was performing surgery in the medical bay while the ship shook apart around him. The Keth Moran commander's voice grew quieter, more disturbed. They reached the Haven's Rest and began emergency evacuation procedures. Davies personally led boarding parties to help evacuate Vorthak families she'd never seen before. Her crew worked for 6 straight hours transferring refugees while we continued attacking them. 6 hours? Admiral Wyaxander's tentacles had gone completely still. They lost half their crew in the process. But they evacuated every single refugee, all 3,000 of them. When we finally captured some of the human survivors, we demanded to know why they had sacrificed themselves for aliens they didn't even know. Vexthal's mandibles stopped clicking entirely, a sign of complete emotional exhaustion in his species. The captured humans looked at us with genuine confusion. They couldn't understand why we were asking the question. To them, the answer was so obvious it didn't require explanation. They kept saying things like, they needed help, and what else could we do? As if risking everything for strangers was as natural as eating or sleeping. The atmospheric recyclers in the officers' lounge seemed to wheeze, as if struggling to process the heavy silence that had settled over the room. Vexthal's exoskeleton had stopped its nervous rattling, replaced by something far more unsettling: complete stillness. When a Kethmoran warrior went completely motionless, it usually meant they were preparing to either fight or flee. But Vexdale looked like he wanted to do both and couldn't decide which. New Geneva was supposed to be a quick siege, he began, his voice so quiet the other officers had to lean forward to hear him. The human colony had no strategic value, just a small mining operation and maybe 50,000 civilians. Our intelligence said they had minimal defenses, outdated weapons, and no chance of receiving reinforcements. Admiral Y.X. Sanders' tentacles moved in slow, hypnotic patterns. Standard siege doctrine suggests surrender within 2 weeks maximum for such position. 2 weeks, Vexdale repeated with a bitter laugh that sounded like grinding metal. We surrounded the planet with 3 full battle groups. Complete orbital blockade, no ships in or out, no supply drops, no communications with the outside galaxy. We cut off their power grid, destroyed their communications array, and disabled their planetary defense systems in the first day. General Korth nodded approvingly. Textbook siege warfare. Forced them to surrender through resource depletion. That's when we learned something about humans that no military academy in the galaxy teaches. They don't seem to understand what surrender means. Not because they're stupid. Our intelligence analysis showed they were actually quite clever. They simply couldn't grasp the concept that sometimes you're supposed to give up. The Zenthri tacticians began making rapid calculations on their portable computers, try to run probability models for what Vexdale was describing. Their antennae twitched with frustration as the numbers refused to make sense. Lieutenant Colonel Jason Hayes was in command of the Planetary Defense Force. Day 1. We sent him standard surrender terms. Lay down your weapons, evacuate military positions, and we would treat civilians according to galactic conventions. His response was to organize the evacuation of a school that was near the combat zone. He agreed to surrender? Colonel Frex asked hopefully. No. He evacuated the school, so the children wouldn't be scared by the noise of the fighting. Then he sent us a message saying that if we wanted the planet, we were welcome to come down and try to take it. But he asked politely if we could avoid shooting near the hospital because they had patients recovering from surgery. The assembled officers stared at Vexdale as if he'd started speaking in ancient mathematics. This behavior pattern didn't exist in any of their military databases. Week 2, their food supplies should have been critically low. We intercepted communications, showing they were down to emergency rations. But instead of surrendering, engineer Nicole Patterson started teaching civilians how to build hydroponic gardens in the subway tunnels. She was growing vegetables underground while bombs fell overhead. Vexdale's claws began their scratching rhythm again, leaving new gouges in the already scarred table surface. Week 4, their ammunition should have been exhausted. Patterson had started making weapons out of kitchen appliances. Microwave ovens became electromagnetic pulse devices. Pressure cookers became improvised artillery shells. She turned a bakery into an ammunition factory. Impossible, muttered General Korth. Civilian equipment cannot be weaponized to military effectiveness. Tell that to the 3 squads of Krillian shock troops who got taken out by what used to be a coffee shop. Patterson had rigged the entire building's plumbing system to spray boiling water mixed with cleaning chemicals. Our soldiers thought they were entering a cafe and walked into a chemical weapon trap built from restaurant supplies. The mood in the lounge grew darker with each detail. These weren't the actions of desperate soldiers making a last stand. This was something entirely different. Month 6. They were sharing their dwindling food supplies with our prisoners of war. Not just sharing. They were giving captured soldiers better meals than their own people were eating. When we asked why, Sergeant Kevin Anderson told us that the prisoners were guests and guests should be fed properly. Admiral Y.X. Sanders' tentacles had begun trembling. They were feeding enemy soldiers while their own people starved. Month 8, we finally breached their final defensive position. I personally led the assault team expecting to find broken, defeated humans begging for mercy. Instead, we found Sergeant Neil Foster sitting in a bomb crater with 12 human children, teaching them basic mathematics using pieces of rubble as counting tools. The silence stretched until it became almost unbearable. Vexdale's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. Foster looked up at our assault troops, 40 armed Kethmoran warriors in full battle armor, and asked if we were there to help with a math lesson. He was genuinely confused about why we looked so aggressive. The children waved at us like we were just visitors who had stopped by during school time. The weight of Vexdale's words settled over the officers' lounge like a toxic cloud. Each alien commander processed the information through their own species' understanding of warfare, survival, and rational thought. And each one came to the same disturbing conclusion. Humans operated by rules that didn't exist anywhere else in the known galaxy. "Let me understand this correctly," General Kort said slowly, his 4 eyes blinking in sequence as he tried to make sense of what he'd heard. Humans don't perform strategic calculations before making decisions that could result in their deaths. Vexdale's mandibles clicked once, a sharp, final sound. They perform calculations, but not the kind we understand. Every other species in the galaxy weighs potential gains against potential losses. The Krillians won't attack unless they have at least a 60% chance of victory. The Zenthri require 75% probability of success before committing to battle. Even the savage Mordhack clans retreat when facing odds worse than 3-1. Admiral Wyaxander's tentacles have begun moving in the complex patterns her species use for deep mathematical analysis. Basic survival instinct should prevent such behavior. Evolution should have eliminated any tendency towards self-destruction for minimal gain. That's exactly what makes them so terrifying, Vexdale continued, his voice growing more agitated with each word. They don't see it as self-destruction for minimal gain. In their minds, saving even one innocent life justifies risking dozens of their own. The mathematics don't compute because they're using a completely different calculation system. The Zenthri tacticians had stopped working on their portable computers entirely. Their antennae drooped in defeat as they realized their probability models were useless for predicting human behavior. What kind of calculation system produces such results? Colonel Frex asked, though his tone suggested he wasn't sure he wanted to know the answer. Before Vexdale could respond, the communication system throughout the ship crackled to life with an urgent priority message from High Command. The metallic voice of the automated system filled the lounge with news that made everyone's blood run cold. Attention, all senior staff. Human Expeditionary Force has accepted mission code Omega-7. Immediate civilian evacuation of Zirian Prime. Intelligence confirms planet is defended by Void Ripper Nest with at least 40 active entities. Estimated survival probability for rescue mission, less than 5%. Repeat, humans have volunteered for certain death mission with 5% survival rate. The officers around the table began their species-specific reactions to stress. General Kort's scales started their nervous rattling. Admiral Wyaxander's tentacles coiled so tightly around her command staff that the crystal began to crack. The Zenthri tacticians made small clicking sounds as they tried to process impossible mathematical scenarios. Who volunteered for the suicide mission? General Kort demanded. The communication system responded with additional details that made the situation even more incomprehensible. Captain Brian Foster of the UES Valiant and Commander Diana Wright of the UES Steadfast volunteered immediately upon receiving mission parameters. Both officers were informed of intelligence reports confirming Zirian Prime as trap scenario. Both officers acknowledged 5% survival probability. Both officers requested immediate departure clearance. Immediately, Admiral Wyaxander's voice cracked with disbelief. They didn't request time to consider the mission, no consultation with their crews, no analysis of alternative strategies. Negative. Captain Foster's exact words were, "There are 2 million civilians down there. When do we leave?" Commander Wright requested additional transport capacity for refugee evacuation. Neither officer expressed concern regarding survival probability. Around the table, the alien officers began doing what they did best, calculating. General Kort pulled out his tactical computer and started running scenarios for resource allocation. The Zenthri tacticians began debating the strategic value of Zirian Prime versus the cost of losing 2 human ships. Admiral Wyaxander started analyzing whether the rescue mission would provide any military advantage that justified the expenditure. But Vexdale had heard enough. The legendary Kethmoran commander stood up slowly, his scarred exoskeleton creaking with the movement. Every eye in the lounge turned toward him as he moved toward the exit with the deliberate pace of someone who had finally reached a decision he'd been avoiding for years. "Commander, where you going?" Admiral Wyaxandra called after him, her tentacles reaching out as if to physically stop his departure. Vexdale paused at the door, but didn't turn around. His voice carried the exhaustion of a warrior who had seen too much and understood too little. "To submit a formal transfer request to High Command. I want reassignment to the Void Ripper Front immediately." "The Void Ripper Front?" Colonel Frex sputtered. "Those creatures exist in multiple dimensions simultaneously. They can erase matter from reality itself. It's considered the most dangerous assignment in the war." "Exactly," Vexdale replied, finally turned to face his fellow officers one last time. His compound eyes reflected the harsh lighting of the lounge, making him look older and more tired than anyone had ever seen him. "I'd rather face beings that can literally eat reality than try to understand a species that treats dying for complete strangers like it's just another routine Tuesday afternoon activity." The door sealed behind him with a soft hiss, leaving the other commanders sitting in stunned silence around their tactical computers and probability calculations.